It's Europe in the fall of 1945. Economies across the continent are in shambles from the Second World War, and the world is on the verge of being split in two between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. In this setting, many international institutions are formed, some with political goals of coordinating militaries and setting up blocs during the Cold War, such as NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and others with the goal of integrating European economies into a unified, stronger economy able to act on the world stage, such as the European Economic Community. The United Nations is also created in this time period as an attempt to preserve peace. At the founding of the United Nations on October 24, 1945, it was made up of 50 different countries, including Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. As a replacement to the League of Nations, its primary goal was maintaining peace. The United Nations didn't play a very active role in regards to the Cold War, because both the United States and the Soviet Union were on its Security Council, which meant that it could not pass resolutions favoring one side or the other. However, in this case, their inability to act enforced their goal of maintaining peace, because they were not able to worsen tensions during the Cold War. A notable exception to this was the use of troops during the Korean War on the side of the Western forces, which came about from a Security Council session in which Russia was not present. This resolution only serves to show that the United Nations is at its most effective when serving as a grounds for compromise between countries, rather than acting militarily to the advantage of a specific set of nations, because their action only resulted in peace terms very similar to the circumstances before the war. This shows that the United Nations enforced its goals of self-determination and peace post-World War II, with varying degrees of success. As opposed to the United Nations, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was an unabashedly Western alliance during the Cold War. It was created by the United States in 1949 as a military alliance against the Soviet Union. The formation of NATO created a Western bloc against the Soviet Union and its satellite states, but it was primarily controlled by the United States, which resulted in some countries searching for more independence from American foreign policy, especially France, who pushed NATO out of France and eventually withdrew the country from NATO in 1966, under the leadership of de Gaulle. With the exception of some internal tensions, however, NATO, along with Southeast Asia Treaty Organization in Asia and the Baghdad Pact in the Middle East, created a strong bloc against the Soviet Union. In response, Russia created the Warsaw Pact in 1955, which served a similar purpose as NATO for the Eastern nations. As opposed to NATO, the Warsaw Pact had a much more authoritarian rule from its leader, Russia, and as such, had more of a backlash after a few years, such as in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. However, since the Soviet Union was not afraid to use force to suppress these uprisings, the Warsaw Pact proved to be as effective as NATO, albeit in a much harsher mindset. The success of both of these institutions led to definitive Eastern and Western blocs and the international character of the Cold War. Many economies in post-war Europe were in shambles, and it was common knowledge that they could not be built up again to become the economic powers they once were unless some sort of fundamental change took place. Out of this climate grew several international institutions with the goal of creating a single Western European free trade area that would boost post-war economies and allow Western Europe to regain the power it once had. Although these organizations never brought Europe the strength it had in centuries past, they were generally successful in strengthening European economy. The first major institution created was the European Coal and Steel Community, which was between the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Italy, and West Germany, and formed a common coal and steel market amongst these Western European nations. In 1957, these same countries signed the Treaty of Rome, which formed the European Economic Community and set the goal of broadening economic integration. The European Economic Community in turn created the Common Market, which effectively met the goal of forming a Western European Free Trade Association. Post-war Europe participated in many international institutions, including the United Nations with goals of maintaining peace and promoting self-determination, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, which created military alliances that internationalized the Cold War, and the eventual European Economic Community, which created a Western European Free Trade Association to strengthen weakened post-war economy. These institutions had varying degrees of success, with the European Economic Community, NATO, and the Warsaw Pact being more effective than the United Nations. However, all of these institutions led Europe into a changed world landscape following the World Wars.